Hello, my name is Natalia, and I'm going to show my presentation on tomatoes and how tomatoes are affected by the soil. So, in this project, the way I had it is I had a garden plot along with tomatoes that I started, all from generally the same size with generally the same leaves and inch size, like growth was pretty much the same. And I made sure to document their start and document their ending. So I have a couple in between measurements as well that I show throughout the project. The way I started was I grabbed about 6 tomatoes. I had some specifically for planting in a pot, and then I had some planted in the ground. The ones that were planted in a pot, I had three. One was tomato, just with nothing in it, just regular soil. They were all watered the same, nothing different. There was a little bit of sun affection, which I will explain later, and I will explain which ones got it because some of them did get affected by that later on. So there was one tomato in the in a pot. There was one tomato in a pot with soil, and then I also had 2 tomatoes in the same pot without soil just to see how they grow differently depending on different aspects. And then compared to that, I had grounded tomatoes, one that was regularly grounded with no added anything to the soil. Then I had one with the compost that we had made that was used with the same potted tomato, as well as 2 tomatoes together in the same part of the ground. So I'm going to start with my presentation. I will show that in a minute. I'm just going to set it up. So on my slideshow, I have it here. It's the effect of different soil treatment on tomato growth by me. Then for the background, how I have it is how I started is I had the tomatoes. They all had their different effects of how they grow. Either they had 2 tomatoes at a time, one tomato regular, or one tomato with the soil. The location did have effect on it, and the location was potted versus grounded. The question was, will different conditions affect how quickly or if the tomatoes will grow? So basically, I was wondering if the tomatoes would grow faster with compost, which was my hypothesis. Would the tomatoes grow faster compared to if the tomatoes would grow slower, or if they would stop growing at all, like the two together, if they would compete with each other, and if so, what would be the effects of that? That was my general hypothesis. So I did have 8 tomatoes. As two, I counted as one, although separately I had 8 tomatoes total. And based on that, they all started growing at the same time. Um, me having three potted and three grounded, of course, if those would differ in comparison, and basically how the soil would affect the rate. Because my main question was, would compost affect the rate of the growth of the tomatoes? And why it's interesting is because the tomatoes specifically that I worked with were heirloom tomatoes, and those, opposed to other tomatoes, actually do have a harder time growing because of the fact that these tomatoes are older. Like the group itself is just an older plant of tomatoes, and because of that, they do have a lot of hard time growing because they're more susceptible to diseases. So for them in general, just growing is kind of a harder process. So these did have a lot of issues growing throughout the process. I did document that as well. I documented yellow leaves. I documented diseases. A lot of the yellow leaves were taken off just to help the tomatoes grow stronger so they could actually focus on the fruit itself rather than those yellow parts. Now about the tomato. The tomato I specifically worked with was heirloom tomato, but the tomato itself has a specific scientific name, which is the Solanum lycopersicum. I did try to say it, but I know I was going to butcher it. It is a flowering plant in the nightshade family. It falls under a dicot as it has two leaves, the cyclodendrons. The tomato leaves are green and hairy with yellow flowers that grow the tomato fruit. That is actually something I didn't know beforehand, and I had learned after gardening that tomatoes grow originally from the fruit. The fruit grows from the flower. The tomato's main pollinator is the wind, and although bumblebees and other native bees are the main component with their buzz pollination, which releases pollen, it does grow mostly from wind. And that is one thing I also had documented throughout the process. The tomatoes that had grown in ground, over time, I had noticed other tomatoes had started to sprout next to it, and although I kept those out of my research, that was something that was cool to notice that other tomatoes had started to grow from these tomatoes. And most of the photos I have here are actually the tomatoes itself. So the one here was the regular tomato without any compost added. These tomatoes are non-native but non-invasive, basically meaning that they do not harm our ecosystem or basically harm whatever place it's in, but it's just not a part of that area. The tomatoes are non-native but non-invasive, hence the originally from South Africa, it was introduced to other regions without causing any significant harm to the new native ecosystem. Basically, you know, re-explains it. Many animals and insects consume tomatoes, including but not limited to deer, rabbits, hornworm, slugs, snails, caterpillars, birds, squirrels, and groundhog. And these tomatoes, although they are prone to getting eaten by animals, there wasn't a significant noticeability. I did notice at some point that one of the tomatoes that were in the pot had been eaten. I had documented that there were bite marks in the tomato leaves. There were like little bite marks, and I wasn't sure exactly what had eaten it, but I had assumed because they were potted, they were in a specific section that something that was able to catch it was able to start eating at the tomato. Otherwise, there weren't other noticeable changes. The seed dispersal strategy works as it is an edible fruit, which means anything that eats it deposits it in their droppings. And these tomatoes were way too small to have noticed a significant change like that, but there was some notice, bite marks. Now, how my method works, although I explained it, I'm going to re-explain it in a better way. Basically, I started off with 8 tomatoes, two together, so three separate groups. They were all the same size around, varying in like 1 inch comparison, which was documented. And I separated them into the groups and I watched them for about 15 to 20 days. So I did document it like every 3 days separately, and there was noticeable growth. They actually did grow pretty quickly, to my surprise, as I didn't know that they could grow that quickly. And throughout the testing, I examined and qualified the growth amount. So every 3 days, I came in and checked it out. My main two groups were the potted tomatoes and the tomatoes in the ground, which were three groups total before because of the two together. The subgroups consisted of the potted regular dirt tomatoes and the ground regular dirt tomatoes. This is the control group for each main category, while the other groups consisted of the potted tomatoes with personally made compost and grounded tomatoes with that same compost. Then there was the other group that had the two together, which was just to see how they would compare if I had two tomatoes together, how they would grow. My dependent growth of the tomatoes were the size, if they had grown any flowers that would lead to then tomatoes, leaf growth, and whether it dies or not. So some tomatoes did have some issues, but I did notice that at the end, all of them did survive pretty well. While the independent is the different conditions the tomatoes had been put through. The analysis. So starting off from this same tomatoes, I visited the tomatoes on like about 10 separate occasions, and I had documented a couple of those days. And I listed the most significant changes. The dependent of the tomatoes, size, leaf growth, And whether it died was one of the things I was looking for. While the independent, as I had said before, was the different conditions they were put through, with that, I made observations and documented those changes alongside outside effects, as I said, the animals or whether something had bitten it or sun shading. There was one tomato that like was in the ground, the two pairs, they had grown a lot slower because of how the fact that the tomatoes had gotten less shade, and then the tomatoes with or that they had gotten more shade, sorry. The tomatoes with the two plants in the ground had gotten more shade, and because of that, they actually grew pretty small compared to their counterpart of the tomatoes with the two plants that were in the pot. I actually had noticed that they had very strong stem roots. Their like stem was very thick and a lot bigger than the grounded tomatoes. And I had noticed that in all the potted tomatoes, which was actually interesting to me because although they were growing in a pot and their space was very minimal compared to the in-ground tomatoes that were growing a lot bigger, these tomatoes in the pots were growing a lot stronger. I think it's because of the fact that they had less space, so they had more to give to everything else in a way. So here is my group. It shows how the no support grounded started on day 0, which was when they all started around 8 to 12 inches, which is what I documented. I have two different inch heights because I documented the shortest height of the tomato. So if you were to look at the tomato, I documented the lowest of where before it starts to root its little sections where the leaves start growing. I documented that. And then I documented the highest one of where it was at the highest before it touched the leaf. So it's still the stem that I was documenting. So it was about 8 to 12 inches for each one. The ones that were two tomatoes, they did grow a little smaller, but I did notice that out of those, there was one that was a lot smaller than the other one because I noticed that out of the whole thing, one did compete with the other more than that. So that is one thing that was different about the regular tomatoes compared to the two pair. As the two pair, they kind of competed for space, which shows up in like their sizing, although they grew together and they kind of worked together in a way that they like one was always going to be stronger. And because of that, after the results, I had noticed that the stronger one had started to grow tomatoes faster than the other. And at this point, all the tomatoes plants have grown tomatoes and they're actually growing pretty strong. I still kept the other ones in a pot and the ones grounded. I have noticed that the grounded ones are actually surviving better because of the fact that their conditions and the fact that they're less likely to get diseases because of the other plants around these tomatoes. I have noticed that the ones in the ground are, in a way like they're getting more yellow leaves, the diseases are more prone to, like all of that is affecting its growth. But either way, each tomato plant is growing at least one tomato as of right now. So, as my results, one thing that is very noticeable, the compost grounded and the compost potted were the ones that grew the best. Out of everything, those grew the best. And the compost that was used was a mix of veggies, egg shells, and it was just kind of like smashed up into dirt. And then that was then like sprinkled into the soil. So it was pretty well blended. I had like mixed it up pretty well that like it wasn't big chunks. It was like little blended up chunks that went into the ground and I mean to the dirt. And basically, with that, I did notice that over time, it was growing a couple inches quicker or a couple inches more, throughout the recording process. And as I said, one thing that did surprise me is that out of all of the plants, all the potted ones had grown a bigger stem, and their stem was actually pretty strong. When I had gone to take out the yellow leaves, I had like snapped them, and the potted ones, their stem was a lot tougher than the ones on the ground. But the ones in the ground had grown a lot bigger and they had more space to grow because of that. And when I had checked their rooting, it was actually very, very deep into the ground compared to the potted, which the pot was like maybe this big at the time of like recording. which didn't allow it that much space, which was very minimal compared to the grounded one that like its roots were like I couldn't even grab it at that point. Like I had digged around it to just to compare to see the root size, and the roots was like just completely everywhere in this big plot. So here, starting at the day zero, they all started around 8 to 12 inches. At the end, the no support grounded ended at around 10 to 13 inches in height, which was different to the no support potted, which was at 9 to 13. It was a little smaller, but then again, it had less yellowing than the grounded, but it also had a bigger stem. While the grounded, I noticed it did have more flowering quicker. A lot of the flowers throughout the process didn't make it, but there are some flowers now that had become tomatoes. Then with the compost grounded, that one started at 12 to inches along with the potted one. And the size difference was actually a lot larger because I noticed that the grounded compost one grew quickest out of all of them compared to the potted. Again, it had less yellowing, less issues with disease, but as well, like the stem being bigger, it just kind of grew a little smaller than the grounded one. And then with the no support, the one in the ground did grow quicker than the one in the potted, but that one actually had issues with dying off because this one happened to be more in the shade and it got less sunlight. And because of that, I had noticed that even though it was growing, there weren't any leaves and there weren't that much flowering. The flowerings kind of died off. Like they would start to flower and then it kind of just die because it didn't have enough nutrients or something to like affect like the growth of it. And because of that, it only actually started growing one tomato, which is growing a lot smaller than the other tomatoes now. With that, the no potted two tomatoes, although it is smaller than the one that's in the ground, I noticed that it grew a lot more leaves than it, and it actually had more like strengths overall. The flowers grew better, and it's actually growing a tomato that's pretty strong now compared to the grounded one. My conclusion was, compared to the potted tomatoes, the regularly planted tomatoes grew the best overall. Between both regular and potted setups, the plants grown in composted soil showed the strongest growth. Based on my research, potted tomatoes developed stronger stems, while the grounded one achieved greater overall size. Since these were heirloom tomatoes, they were more susceptible to disease, which impacted their growth. Again, said with the yellowing, I had taken those off just to prevent any increase of like, diseases. So I prevented it before it could continue. In this case, the pots with the two tomatoes growing together, the one plant usually outcompeted the other. By the end of the project, at least one tomato had begun growing on each tomato. And at this point, the tomatoes documented are around like this size. They're not too big, but they have grown a lot since the end results of this. By the end results, they were just budding the tomatoes a little bit. You could see like the little roundness. And now especially there's more coming in. The ones that didn't really start growing tomatoes are growing little ones. And although it does take time, I'm still watching over them to just ensure that they grow to their best ability. From this project, I found that the soil quality and the space play important roles in the plant development. My data aligned with other studies that suggest compost improves plant strength and that limited root space, like in plants, can lead to sturdier stems but may limit overall size. These findings suggest that in general, plants thrive when given significant space and nutrient-rich soil, that competition and disease susceptibility can significantly affect growth outcomes. Now, for future result ideas, one thing that would be helpful is to study the larger number of tomato plants, overall, a longer period to better understand growth trends and disease resistance. Although I only really had one plant for each group, it would have been better if I had maybe had multiple, been able to compare more overall, had like given the tomatoes more time to grow, because even after the results, still a lot came in. Like now the tomatoes have changed a lot compared to before. The two in the ground together, they're just the stem and it's growing one tomato with very minimal leaves compared to the one in the pot that is growing so well with like multiple tomatoes growing. growing and it has strong stems. It's just like that difference is like very large. And because of that, that would have been nice to have for future research ideas. If I could compare the different types of compost or pot sizes, could also have given more insight into optimizing plant health. Additionally, using heirloom and hybrid tomatoes side by side could have shown how genetics affect growth and resilience. So if I'd use heirlooms versus cherry or something like that, I could see how different tomatoes grow and the effect of that. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned more about tomatoes because I definitely did. And it was a fun project to do as much as I loved it. And now I have tomatoes to grow, which is so fun. Thank you.